Have you ever lost someone you deeply cared about and found yourself questioning why it happened? Maybe it was a friendship that unexpectedly fell apart, a relationship that ended despite all your efforts, or even a family bond that seemed unbreakable but somehow faded over time. It's painful. It's confusing. And if you're like most people, your first instinct was probably to ask, what went wrong? Or did I do something to cause this? But what if I told you that sometimes the people who walk away or the ones God removes are not meant to stay in your life? What if I told you that instead of rejection, this separation is actually divine redirection? God doesn't just allow people to leave your life randomly. He is intentional in everything he does. Sometimes the absence of someone is actually his presence working for your good, but in the moment, it doesn't feel that way. It feels like loss, like unanswered questions, like a door closing without an explanation. That's exactly why today we're going to explore a truth that could shift your entire perspective on heartbreak and relational loss. We'll dive deep into why divine separations happen and why trusting God's plan can lead to something far greater than what you lost. So if you've ever wrestled with letting go, if you've ever struggled to understand why God allows people to walk away, stay with me, because by the end of this, you might just see that what felt like an ending was actually a new beginning in disguise. When someone leaves your life, whether by choice, circumstance, or even betrayal, it's natural to feel a deep sense of loss. Maybe you replay conversations in your mind, wondering what you could have done differently. Maybe you struggle with feelings of rejection, questioning your worth, or perhaps you wrestle with the silence left behind, feeling abandoned and unsure of how to move forward. The pain of separation is real. It's heavy, and for many, it feels like a wound that refuses to heal. Even when we know logically that certain people may not have been the best for us, our hearts still ache for what was familiar. There's something about human connection that makes it so difficult to release, especially when you've invested time, love, and energy into a person. And let's be honest, sometimes when people walk away or when relationships fall apart, it doesn't always feel like God is in control. Instead, it feels chaotic. It feels unfair. It feels like something has been taken from you without your permission. But here's what I want you to consider. What if that loss was actually God's protection? What if that closed door was him redirecting you to something better, something greater, something more aligned with his purpose for your life? C.S. Lewis once said, "Getting over a painful experience is much like crossing monkey bars. You have to let go at some point in order to move forward." And that's exactly the challenge so many of us face. We want to move forward, but we don't want to let go. We want to step into something new, but we're still holding on to the old. Letting go is one of the hardest things God asks us to do, but it is also one of the most necessary. Because sometimes what you're clinging to is the very thing keeping you from stepping into God's best for you. Think about it. What if the relationship you're trying so hard to save is actually draining your spirit instead of strengthening it? What if the friendship that ended was actually preventing you from growing into who God created you to be? What if the person who left was never meant to go with you into the next season of your life? It's a hard truth to accept, but sometimes God removes people not to hurt you, but to heal you. He allows separations because he sees what we don't. He hears conversations we never will. He knows what is happening behind closed doors when we're unaware. And yet in the moment of loss, it's difficult to see this. When you're in the middle of heartbreak, everything feels personal. You might wonder, why would God allow this pain if he loves me? But here's something we must always remember. God's love doesn't always mean keeping things together. Sometimes it means breaking things apart so something better can be built. That's why we need to shift our perspective on relational loss. Instead of seeing it as just an ending, we need to start seeing it as a divine transition, a realignment, a preparation for something greater. And to fully understand this, we need to go to Scripture, because the Bible is filled with examples of God separating people for a greater purpose. When we look at Scripture, we see a recurring pattern. God often removes certain people from the lives of his chosen ones to fulfill a greater purpose. This isn't just something that happens randomly or without reason. Every separation, every closed door, and every relational shift is part of his divine plan. Let's start with Abraham and Lot. In Genesis 13, we see that Abraham and his nephew Lot had traveled together for years. But as they grew in wealth, tension arose between their herdsmen, and the land could no longer support them both. It would have been easy for Abraham to fight to keep Lot close. After all, Lot was family. They had history. They'd built a life together. But instead of clinging to what was familiar, Abraham allowed God to guide the separation. And what happened next? Immediately after Lot left, God gave Abraham a powerful vision of his future. It was only after the separation that God told Abraham, "Lift up your eyes from where you are and look north and south, east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever." Genesis 13:14. Sometimes God waits until we let go of certain people before he reveals what he has for us. As long as Lot was with Abraham, there was distraction, conflict, and limitation. But the moment Lot left, Abraham had clarity. Could it be that God is waiting for you to release someone before he shows you what's next? Another powerful example is Joseph and his brothers. Joseph was betrayed by his own family, sold into slavery by the very people who were supposed to protect him. If anyone had a reason to feel abandoned, it was Joseph. If anyone had a reason to believe God had forgotten him, it was Joseph. And yet, what seemed like a devastating separation was actually the setup for his greatest calling. Had Joseph stayed with his brothers, he would have never become the ruler of Egypt. He would have never been in a position to save thousands of lives, including the very family that betrayed him. Years later, when Joseph was finally reunited with his brothers, he spoke one of the most powerful truths in Scripture. "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." What does this teach us? That sometimes the very thing that feels like betrayal is actually God setting us apart for something greater. Joseph had to be separated in order to step into his destiny. The betrayal wasn't the end of his story, it was the bridge to his purpose. And then there's Jesus himself. During his time on earth, Jesus faced rejection from the very people he came to save. The crowds that once praised him later turned against him. One of his own disciples, Judas, betrayed him. Peter denied him. And yet, every single one of those separations was necessary for the fulfillment of God's ultimate plan. Think about it. If Judas had never betrayed Jesus, the crucifixion wouldn't have happened in the way it did. If the crowds had never turned on him, he wouldn't have been led to the cross. And if he had never been crucified, we wouldn't have salvation today. What does this mean for us? That even when people walk away, even when relationships fall apart, and even when we experience deep heartbreak, God is still working. He is still sovereign. He is still in control. And just like he used separation to fulfill his purpose in Abraham, in Joseph, and in Jesus, he is using it in your life too. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "We are not necessarily doubting that God will do the best for us. We are wondering how painful the best will turn out to be." And isn't that the truth? We trust that God has a plan, but we struggle with the process. We know he is leading us somewhere good, but we wrestle with the pain of the journey. But what if we stopped seeing separation as a punishment and started seeing it as preparation? What if instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" we started asking, "God, what are you preparing me for?" Because the truth is, sometimes God isn't just removing someone from your life. He is removing you from a situation that could hinder your purpose. And when we begin to see relational loss through this lens, we find peace in what once felt like devastation. Now that we understand this biblical foundation, the question remains, how do we actually surrender to God's plan when it hurts so much? How do we let go when everything in us wants to hold on? Let's talk about that next. Agora é sua vez de revisar. Se estiver tudo certo, seguimos para a próxima parte, que abordará como confiar na separação mesmo quando dói. Claro! Aqui está a reescrita da parte anterior, mantendo o mesmo conteúdo e extensão, mas com novas palavras e estrutura fluida. Trusting the separation, how to surrender when it hurts. Even when we recognize that divine separations serve a greater purpose, the reality remains, letting go is never easy. When someone exits our life, whether a friend, a romantic partner, a mentor, or even a family member, it often feels as if a part of us is being taken away. The time spent together, the memories built, the shared dreams, it can suddenly seem like everything was in vain. In these painful moments, it's natural to wrestle with God, asking, why did you allow this? Why bring this person into my life only for them to leave? Why does it hurt so much? The truth is, trusting God in times of separation is one of the greatest challenges of faith. It demands that we believe in His goodness, even when we feel abandoned. It requires us to trust in His wisdom, even when we don't understand His reasoning. And this is where the real test lies, not just in the loss itself, but in how we respond to it. When we experience heartbreak, we stand at a crossroads. We can either resist God's will, desperately clinging to what was, or we can surrender and allow Him to lead us forward. One of the most difficult things to accept is that when God removes someone from our life, it is never without reason. Yet, instead of releasing, we often try to hold on, replaying conversations in our mind, wondering what we could have done differently, searching for ways to mend what has been broken. But what if, in His wisdom, God is saying, this season is over. Trust me as I guide you into the next. A powerful example of this struggle is found in the story of Saul and David. In 1 Samuel 16, God had already rejected Saul as king and chosen David to take his place. Yet Saul refused to accept what God had already decreed. Instead of yielding, he spent years obsessively pursuing David, trying to destroy him, and ultimately living in a state of torment, all because he was unwilling to let go of something God had already called finished. This is a trap many fall into. We exhaust ourselves chasing something that God has already closed the door on, believing that if we fight hard enough, we can change the outcome. But when God removes someone, it is not a punishment, it is protection. Holding on to something He has taken away only delays our healing, our peace, and our ability to embrace what He has in store for us. Another difficult reality to accept is that we don't always see the full picture. We look at a relationship and see only the good, the love, and the connection. But God sees deeper. He hears conversations we were never meant to hear, knows the intentions of the heart, and understands the impact certain people will have on our future. Isaiah 55, 8-9 reminds us of this truth. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. If we truly believe that God's ways are higher, then we must trust that every separation is ultimately for our good, even when it doesn't feel that way. How many times have we desperately wanted something, only to later realize that it would have been a disaster? How many times have we looked back on a past relationship and thought, thank God that didn't work out? The same God who protected you then is still protecting you now. The pain of separation can often consume us, making it hard to see anything beyond the hurt. It's easy to dwell on what was lost rather than focus on what God is doing through it. However, pain is never without purpose. As C.S. Lewis insightfully put it, pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is His megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Pain, though difficult, is often a tool God uses to shape us. It refines, strengthens, and teaches us lessons we might not have learned otherwise. Consider the story of Job. He lost everything, his health, his wealth, even his family. Yet, through his suffering, he encountered God in a way he never had before. When God restored him, the true blessing wasn't just in regaining what was lost, but in the deeper understanding of God that he gained through the experience. Likewise, God allows certain people to leave our lives not to harm us, but to make way for something greater. His plan is always to move us forward, but we must be willing to release the past. Instead of asking, why did this happen? We should ask, God, what do you want to do in me through this? Instead of dwelling on why did they leave, we should shift to what's next. Romans 8:28 reassures us of this promise, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. God doesn't waste pain. He doesn't allow loss without preparing something better. If we truly believe that He is in control, we must also believe that when He removes something, He is making space for something greater. So rather than resisting, we can choose to trust. Rather than fearing the unknown, we can believe that what God has planned surpasses anything we are leaving behind. Every closed door, every painful goodbye, and every unexpected separation is ultimately leading us towards something better, toward a future that aligns with His perfect will. When God begins to remove someone from your life, it's not always immediate or obvious. Sometimes He doesn't take them away outright. He gives you signs, gentle warnings, and even loud wake-up calls. The problem is, many of us don't want to see those signs. We ignore them, rationalize them, and convince ourselves that we just need to try harder, pray more, or be more patient. But God is not a God of confusion, 1 Corinthians 14:33. And when He wants you to move on, He makes it clear. The question is, are you willing to listen? Let's look at some of the ways God signals that it's time to let go. Tesh 1. The relationship is pulling you away from God. One of the clearest indicators that God is asking you to let someone go is when that relationship is leading you further from Him rather than drawing you closer. It could be a friend who encourages you to compromise your values, a romantic partner who weakens your faith, or even a family member who constantly fills your heart with doubt and negativity. If someone's presence in your life is making it harder for you to hear God, to trust Him, or to walk in obedience, then that relationship is not from Him. C.S. Lewis once said, "Look for yourself, and you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ, and you will find Him, and with Him, everything else thrown in." If a relationship is causing you to lose sight of God, it's time to realign your focus. Any connection that dims your spiritual light rather than strengthens it is not a connection God wants for you. 2. There is no peace, only confusion and chaos. God operates in peace, not disorder. That doesn't mean that every relationship will be perfect or without challenges, but there is a difference between working through difficulties together and constantly living in a state of anxiety, turmoil, or emotional exhaustion. If you find yourself constantly drained, second-guessing, or trying to force something to work that just doesn't seem to fit, it may be a sign that God is asking you to let go. Isaiah 26:3 reminds us, "You will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast because they trust in you." If you have to beg for someone's attention, if you're always questioning where you stand, if the relationship is filled with stress instead of joy, then it's worth asking, is this from God, or am I holding on to something He's trying to remove? 3. You keep hitting dead ends and obstacles. Another sign that God is closing a door is when, no matter how hard you try, things just won't work out. You keep running into the same conflicts. Every attempt to move forward is met with resistance. The doors keep closing, and yet instead of accepting it, you keep trying to break them down. This reminds me of Jonah. God had a plan for Jonah, but Jonah resisted. He ran in the opposite direction of where God was leading him, and because of that, he found himself in a storm, thrown overboard, and swallowed by a great fish. Jonah 1:1-17. God could have allowed him to keep running, but instead, He made sure Jonah had no choice but to surrender. Sometimes we are just like Jonah, desperately trying to hold on to something God is asking us to release. But when God is removing someone, He will allow circumstances to make it increasingly difficult to continue down that path. Doors will close, opportunities will dry up. The things that once worked will no longer work. It's not punishment, it's protection. You feel drained instead of strengthened. Relationships should not be perfect, but they should be edifying. Proverbs 27:17 says, "As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another." The right people in your life will challenge you, encourage you, and strengthen your walk with God. But the wrong ones will deplete you, manipulate you, and leave you feeling empty. Ask yourself, does this relationship make me stronger, or does it weaken me? Do I feel encouraged, or do I feel constantly drained? Does this person help me grow in faith, or do they pull me further into fear and doubt? The enemy often uses people to distract, delay, and destroy. If you feel spiritually exhausted after every interaction with someone, it may be time to ask whether this relationship is truly part of God's plan for you. 5. God has been showing you the truth, but you keep ignoring it. Perhaps the most painful sign is when God has already revealed the truth, but you keep trying to rewrite the story. Maybe he has shown you red flags, but you keep making excuses. Maybe he has removed peace, but you keep convincing yourself that it will get better. Maybe he has already spoken through his word, but you are hoping he will change his answer. God is patient, but he will not force you to obey. He gives us free will, and sometimes he allows us to hold on to things we were never meant to carry, simply so we can learn the lesson ourselves. But what if we didn't have to learn the hard way? What if we trusted him the first time he spoke? When Samuel was grieving over Saul's downfall, God asked him a powerful question. How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? 1 Samuel 16:1. In other words, why are you still holding on to what I have already called finished? God is asking many of us the same question today. How long will you hold on to that relationship, that friendship, that situation, when God has already made it clear that it's over? How long will you fight to keep something that he is trying to remove? Sometimes we don't realize how heavy something was until we finally put it down. Final thoughts. Recognizing when God is asking you to move on is not always easy, but it is necessary. Trusting him means believing that his plan is greater than our own, even when we don't see the full picture. If he is asking you to let go, it is not because he wants to hurt you. It is because he wants to heal you. As C.S. Lewis beautifully said, there are far, far better things ahead than any we leave behind. You may not see it now, but one day you will look back and thank him for every door he closed, every relationship he ended, and every situation he removed. Because what he has planned for you is always better than what you were willing to settle for. As we reach the conclusion of our exploration into trusting God's timing in relationships, it's important to remember that the process of letting go and moving forward is never easy, but it is always transformative. Throughout our lives, God is constantly guiding us, orchestrating moments of separation and connection in ways that may seem mysterious or painful at the time, but which ultimately lead to his greater purpose for us. When we trust God's timing, we acknowledge that he sees the bigger picture, one that we cannot yet fully understand. His decisions are rooted in love and care for our future, and when he asks us to move on from someone or something, it is because he has something better in store for us. Just as C.S. Lewis beautifully captured in his writings, God's love often works in ways that are not immediately apparent to us, yet it is through these divine interventions that we are shaped into who he has called us to be. Romans 8:28 assures us that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Even when relationships end or paths diverge, God is always working behind the scenes, weaving together the threads of our lives into a beautiful tapestry of his perfect will. Trusting in his timing allows us to relinquish control and find peace in his guidance. It gives us the confidence to move forward, knowing that every goodbye is a divine step toward a new beginning. Our hearts may ache, but in surrendering to God's timing, we find the strength to heal, to grow, and to embrace the future with hope and faith. In these moments of separation, remember that God's love is constant. He has not abandoned you. He is simply preparing you for what lies ahead. The people who are meant to walk alongside you will come at the right time, and those who are no longer part of your journey are making room for the new blessings he has waiting. As you continue to trust in God's timing, lean on his promises, and allow his perfect love to guide you through the transitions in your relationships, you will experience the peace that only he can provide. His plan is always greater than ours, and when we trust him with our relationships, we can be assured that he is working everything out for our good in his perfect time. Remember that each step of the journey is a part of his divine plan, and with each new chapter, you are being shaped into the person God has always intended for you to be. So as you move forward, walk in the confidence that God is always with you, guiding you, and orchestrating your relationships according to his perfect will. His timing is always right.